To welcome everyone as we kick off the 165th annual commemoration of the Battle of San Jacinto today and tomorrow. My name is Jeff Dunn. I'm chairman of the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board. And I would like to begin by recognizing some of those who made this event possible. Our event is sponsored by a partnership of public and private entities, including the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the San Jacinto Museum of History Association, the San Jacinto chapters of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas and the Sons of the Republic of Texas, the San Jacinto Descendants, and the Harris County Historical Commission. On behalf of our advisory board, I would like to thank each of our partner organizations, their leaders, and their volunteers for their cooperation and support in making this first ever symposium a reality. The San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board was created by the Texas Legislature in 1965 to advise the Parks and Wildlife Department on the interpretation of the San Jacinto Battleground State Park. In addition to our stated responsibility, for many years our board has coordinated the annual San Jacinto Day commemoration. Tomorrow's event at the State Park will begin at 10 a.m. and we have some flyers up front. There was a whole day of activities, but our board is responsible for the official ceremony. And I would like to thank our board member, Jan DeVault, who chaired the Commemoration Day Committee for arranging all the events for tomorrow. This year, our board took on the extra burden of coordinating this event. We believe that it is important not only to commemorate the battle at the San Jacinto Battleground, but also to provide a forum to educate the public about cutting-edge research pertaining to the San Jacinto campaign. By doing this, we hope that the people of Texas will better appreciate the importance of the battleground, the monument, and the museum, and the symbolism of San Jacinto as our state's greatest heritage. And we hope to encourage more research and attention on this important phase of Texas and Mexico's history on both sides of the Rio Grande, and to bring more Mexican and Texan scholars together for these kinds of conferences in the future. Another member of our board, Nina Hindi, assumed the lion's share of the administrative responsibility for this event, and I would also like to thank her personally for all her work and effort in making this event possible. And also, she was assisted by Jack and Shirley Lightfoot, and thank you very much to each of you for the hard work. The fourth member of our board, and we only have 4 members, is Bill Connor, who is also chairman of the board of the San Jacinto Museum of History Association. Bill has spent countless hours over the past few months working to enhance public support for the museum and the state park, and has also promoted the sponsorship of this symposium as well as tomorrow's Commemoration Day ceremony. Bill is performing a very valuable service to the people of Texas, and I would like to thank him also for all he is doing on behalf of San Jacinto. So, Bill, would you please stand? Where are you? And last but certainly but not least, I would like to thank the Summerlee Foundation in Dallas and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation for their financial administrative assistance. It is sometimes said that we Texans take our history seriously, and this is exemplified by the fact that by the Summerlee Foundation, which focuses so much of its resources on events such as this one. John Crane of the Summerlee Foundation is here today, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank John for all of his work in preserving the history of Texas. Where's John? Thank you very much. The celebration of San Jacinto Day is our state's greatest and most recognized annual historic tradition. It commemorates a brief battle that occurred on April 21st, 1836, at the San Jacinto River, about 20 miles east of present-day Houston. The number of combined participants in that battle amounted to less than 2,500 men, a number that appears deceptively insignificant. But the battle and the events following the battle had far-reaching consequences. The Texan victory sealed Mexico's loss of Texas and enabled Texans to establish a functioning independent republic in an orderly manner, thus giving Texans a unique heritage among the states of having a nationhood all of our own for 9 years. This symposium will focus on the Mexican side of the issue, and in particular, what was going on within the Mexican army immediately after Santa Anna's defeat at San Jacinto, and what led to the decision of the Mexican army to retreat from Texas. This thing recognizes that San Jacinto was not just an episode in Texas history, but was also an event of great significance in Mexican history as well. And we also know that the hostility and bloodshed of 1836 has now given way to a strong bond of friendship between Texas and Mexico. And we hope that the knowledge generated by this symposium will result in further research and study so that the bonds of friendship that now exist will be further strengthened with a better understanding of our shared legacy and common heritage. We have a few preliminary speeches before we get to our speakers. And at this time, I'd like to call to the podium Dean Andrew Ackenbaum, who is bringing greetings from the University of Houston. Dean Ackenbaum is a professor of history and is Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Houston. He is also one of the nation's leading authorities on gerontology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ackenbaum.
Good afternoon. On behalf of Chancellor Arthur Smith and my immediate boss, Provost Ed Sheridan, I welcome you all here this afternoon for what looks like it's going to be a terrific intellectual feast, which, like any good dean, I will miss most of because I'm herding cats. Before I started herding cats, I was born in the shadow of Valley Forge. In fact, I'm willing to bet that maybe only 2 or 3 other of our neighbors could have lived closer to Valley Forge than we did. If I mowed beyond our front lawn, I would have been violating 6 federal statutes. Given that sort of upbringing, there were certain times in the year in which kids that looked like me would end up at the Washington Memorial Chapel, would join Boy Scout troops. I slept in my backyard, at national jamborees. And then, once a year, my parents would drag their 3 motley kids into the backseat of the car, and we'd take a short drive to Gettysburg, where one of my forebears was on the side that eventually won, although his particular contributions didn't help much for that cause. How odd to then move 20 months ago to Texas, which to this good Yankee was always there somewhere. Oh, I remembered the Alamo. I had seen it 4 or 5 times. Davy Crockett was one of my heroes. But the rest of the stuff, I wasn't even sure how to pronounce that monument. But about a week after I got here, I figured, because I could feel Valley Forge calling me, that I really ought to go see this, is it San Jacinto, is that how you pronounce it? Memorial Battleground. I'm a historian by training. I shouldn't have been blown away quite to the extent that I was. But I was. Because it occurred to me, I didn't know a darn thing about what had happened until I walked inside that museum. And I really thought that the Yellow Rose of Texas was something that Jackson Perkins produced sometime after they produced the Queen Elizabeth Rose. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that that's the great reason why history matters. Yes, it's important for you all, we all. I now have a flag of Texas off my 2nd floor balcony. It's very important for us to remember this battleground for what it tells us about the history of this state. But you know, we've now produced 3 of the most recent presidents of the United States. There's just an off chance that people who don't live in Texas are going to have to learn a thing or 2 about the Alamo and San Jacinto. Not much. I've taught history too long to not expect too much. But they're going to have to learn something. And that's why, in part, this afternoon fascinates me too. The historical landscape is changing. The history of the United States is in part the history of who got the most and who got the less. But it's basically an extraordinary story about how boundaries changed, compromises were forged, and people of different colors learned to cooperate when they weren't fighting. And so I quite agree with the introductory remarks. What's really significant here is that a bunch of very bright people have gathered here for lunch to listen for a while to a bunch of other bright people, and then to engage in conversations about the meaning of it all. Such conversations should take place close in the shadow of San Jacinto at a public university that means to welcome people to its ranks, to think carefully about where we've been and where we're heading. So once again, on behalf of the University of Houston, I welcome you to a feast.
Thank you very much. We certainly have appreciated the accommodations here. We're next going to have remarks from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. The department is responsible for maintaining the San Jacinto Battleground State Park, and we are pleased to have with us today Bill Dolman, who is Director of Professional Support Service for the State Parks Division, and he's also the liaison to our San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board. So I'd like to call Bill to the podium.
Thank you very much. I really didn't know my name was on the program, Jeff. I had a preacher tell me once that a good sermon consisted of three major points, and I'm going to try to make three points, but I will try to be unlike a sermon and be brief. First of all, my first point is it is really a great thing to be able to welcome you on behalf of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, to recognize in the audience many good friends. I want to particularly recognize Gervais Bell, with whom I've had a close association for over 15 years, past president of the Museum Association and a very dear friend and historian. I also want to thank the speakers, because they're the ones who are going to hopefully help us see things in a different way. I also want to thank my good friend John Crane with the Summerlee Foundation. John has been extremely helpful in putting together seminars of this kind, which have helped to broaden our understanding of Texas history, and the Summerlee Foundation is deeply committed to that. My second point has to do with point of view. A lot of what we're talking about today really reflects point of view. And having been involved in Texas history and throughout my whole Texas Parks and Wildlife career, now approaching 27 years, I've certainly been exposed to all of the traditional interpretations. I know very well many members of the Sons and Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and appreciate, as they certainly do, the wonderful things that have been accomplished in Texas during that Revolutionary War period. Recently, however, I happened to find myself in the middle of a little point of view controversy over Goliad. And again, it wasn't really an interpretation, it wasn't an issue of disagreeing over basic facts. It was totally about point of view and trying to establish a dialogue to establish a recognition of both points of view. The important thing that happens here with these kind of discussions is that if you have differing points of view, which is very much a scholarly activity. I mean, the fact that we have Professor Miguel Soto from Mexico is indeed a wonderful opportunity to us that is, to my knowledge, very new in this type of setting. The fact that we have recognized scholars like Jim Crisp, whom I've known more years than here I care to admit, and Greg Dimmick, a newer friend, and others like our film historian Frank Thompson, is a tribute to the planners of this event. The way this point of view issue gets addressed is through my third point, which is the importance of this scholarship. If you don't have the facts straight as well as the facts straight from the differing perspectives, you're never going to reach any kind of agreement or mutual understanding. And I think the key point here is you don't really have to agree 100%, but you do have an obligation to understand from differing perspectives. Culturally, Texas is what it is because of San Jacinto. San Jacinto is right at the heart of what makes a Texian, use the archaic use of the term Texan. And yet, Texas is changing. Part of that change is to recognize that we have a very complex dynamic that went on in 1836 involving Hispanics. I'll digress for 1 second. Yesterday I was at a rather unpopular bill hearing on transfer of the Alamo, which I wouldn't lose any sleep over, by the way. But the sponsor of the bill, as you probably know, is the black representative from the city of Houston. One of the speakers who opposed the bill made the point that it wouldn't have any blacks in the organization, which he asked about, because there were very few blacks in Texas in 1836. I'm sorry, I beg to differ. So if our friends for the sons and daughters also have maybe a few things to learn, as we all do, and we hope that today is a step on that road. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. It is now my pleasure to introduce George Donnelly. George was selected as president of the San Jacinto Museum of History Association last fall. And during his brief tenure as president of the museum, he has spent many hours promoting the museum around the state to the news media about the importance of the park, the monument, the museum, and the proposed long-range master plan that will provide significant enhancements to the park. All of us who care for San Jacinto are very appreciative of George's efforts. So please join me in welcoming George Donnelly.
Good afternoon. Dressed in Irish garb, you can well appreciate that. Unfortunately, I came at the last second because today we also kick off the Houston International Festival honoring Ireland. And I had the distinct privilege of spending a few minutes with the Madam President, Mrs. Mary McAleese, who is a charming person and a political personality who could win an election regardless of what country she was in. I would vote for her, as we do sometimes in Latin America, often. Right, Ann? The Museum of History and the San Jacinto Advisory Board, the sons and daughters, the descendants, are all very, very closely linked to making sure that we preserve the history of Texas and the birthplace of the Republic of Texas. There's no question that I'm extremely honored to be a part of this organization and learn every day from people around me about the real Texas that I didn't know growing up south of the border. I learned more about Simón Bolívar and José Martí and people like that than I learned about Mr. Santa Anna. But it's a privilege to be able to learn and to interpret and to disseminate. And what we have done in the last several months, and particularly the last couple weeks or this month with the good help of Diane Powell, who is our guru in marketing and public relations, is to really get the story across of San Jacinto throughout the state. And I too echo the words of Bill Dolman regarding the Summerlee Foundation and John Crane. Thank you very much for all of your support all the time. It's people like John and the Summerlee Foundation that allow us to preserve the image and the spirit of what San Jacinto has meant to all of us. And obviously we have many major plans with regard to the growth and to the restoration. We're putting in a new museum, putting in a new visitor center. Many Houstonians have wondered, where did that San Jacinto Inn go? And maybe it was the last time they were at San Jacinto. Well, it's our intention to put a new restaurant inside of the visitor center called San Jacinto Inn. And yesterday when I was speaking to the Downtown Rotary Club, quite a few of them not only expressed their interest in having the restaurant there, but they wanted to make sure that the same menu was there. And somebody from way in the back said, at the same prices. I see we have some support here as well. Well, we want to make this your monument, your museum, your battleship, your battleground, and make it more interactive for all of you. The tremendous amount of artifacts and collections that we have stored in the monument, which are not on display just simply because there's no space. And thanks to a very, very generous endowment from the Herstein Foundation, we are cataloging over 300 or 400,000 almost artifacts and thousands of books so that they become available to all of us to share the history of Texas dating back to the 1400s. And so when it's there, and we'll try to do it as soon as possible, and I know that a lot of people are working on the legislative front so that Texas Parks and Wildlife can get the public sector funding for this, so that we in turn can go after the private sector funding, recognizing as foundations that are sophisticated, and all of them are, what is it that the state will do for you? Well, hopefully in the next week, or next month, we'll have an answer for them with regard to the commitment of the state, primarily through a government obligation bond that has passed the House and is moving over to the Senate. And if we can ask all of you to serve as our lobbyist, do remember the words HJR 97, House Joint Resolution 97. It's sort of tough to not be able to provide the necessary funding for the birthplace of Texas, but we know there's a crunch in Austin, but we're making sure that every effort is put in to get the right kind of commitment from them for San Jacinto. This is a great symposium. I'm delighted that my good friend Miguel Soto is here. I had a chance to meet the other speakers last night. Bienvenido, Miguel, a sus órdenes, and thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you, George. Before I introduce our distinguished guest speakers, we felt it was important to put the theme of this conference in its proper historic context, and I've been asked to do that. So please bear with me for a few moments so that we can set the stage for the issues that our speakers will be discussing. After Mexican independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico made a strong effort to encourage American immigration to Texas. Large land grants were offered under authorized colonization contracts on terms that were far more favorable than what could be obtained on the American frontier. The land was practically free, 10 cents an acre, as compared to $1.25 an acre for inferior land in the United States. Mexico did impose certain restrictions on these immigrants, namely that they would have to become loyal Mexican citizens and abide by the national religion of Catholicism. But these restrictions did not stop thousands of mostly Protestant Americans from pouring into Texas in the 1820s. Mexico was on friendly terms with the United States in those days, and many Americans viewed Mexicans favorably in light of their struggle against the European Spaniards. Mexico showed its admiration for its northern neighbor by adopting a constitution in 1824 that was modeled to a large extent after the United States Constitution. A federal government was created with Mexico City as the capital. States were also created, and Texas was joined with Coahuila to become the state of Coahuila y Tejas. By the late 1820s, however, Mexico was beginning to believe that its immigration policy was becoming too successful. Instead of creating a buffer of loyal citizens against the westward moving tide of American civilization, it was becoming increasingly apparent that these immigrants from the United States might be the advance guard for American expansion. In some respects, Mexico faced an immigration problem that was the reverse of what the United States is experiencing today with some of its Latin American neighbors. Texans were demanding that official proceedings and laws use the English language instead of the Spanish language. They wanted to introduce features of the American government that were unknown in Mexico, such as the right to trial by jury. Many Texans brought slaves with them and expected legal protection for their peculiar institution. But American-style slavery was largely unknown and unfamiliar to Mexicans. Texans also wanted self-determination through local autonomy and statehood within the Mexican Federation. These attitudes and concerns, combined with repeated attempts by the United States to purchase Texas, as well as the problem of illegal immigration, where Americans would come to Texas and settle outside of the authorized colonization contracts. These things greatly alarmed the Mexican officials. Mexico responded by trying to reverse American immigration as best as it could. It began in 1829 when slavery was abolished in Mexico, thereby adopting a strong moral stand against that practice, but simultaneously and primarily trying to discourage further immigration from the United States. But the Texans largely ignored that decree or got around it by forcing their slaves to sign indentured servitude contracts for 99 years. So Mexico tried a stronger measure. The law of April 6, 1830 prohibited immigration from the United States and authorized a ring of military forts around the Texan settlements to secure the integrity of Mexico's border with the United States. Also, customs duties were imposed for the first time to discourage trade between Texas and the United States and to encourage it between Texas and the settlements in the southern part of Mexico. This law became very controversial. Conventions were held in Texas in 1832 and 1833 in protest, but Mexican officials pointed out that even those conventions were in themselves illegal under Mexican law. But the Mexicans did listen to the Texans' concerns, and they did try to accommodate the Texans as best as they could. By 1834, the anti-immigration provisions of the 1830 law were repealed, and Mexico did begin to implement some of the reforms that the Texans desired, but refused to grant separate statehood within the Mexican Federation. Mexico might have been able to address its problems with Texas more effectively, except for its own internal problems, which were creating significant political instability. As a new country, Mexico struggled to pattern itself on the successful government model of the United States, but Mexico did not have the experience or the heritage of a republican form of government to guide them, as the Americans did with the English form of common law. As a result, a strong party emerged in Mexico with its aim to centralize the government. In 1835, the Centralists succeeded in taking over the government and abolished the 1824 Constitution. And so, at the time the Texans were clamoring for separate statehood within the Mexican Federation, the Mexican government had abolished the states altogether. The Centralists had handed the Texans the perfect pretext for a revolution. During the initial phase of the Texas Revolution in the fall of 1835, Texans were fighting to preserve the 1824 Constitution. But this effort did not generate significant support from the Mexican interior, even among the Federalists who might have otherwise sympathized with the Texans. Instead, the Centralists cleverly characterized the Texan revolt, sort of a spin movement is what we would call today, spin control, as they characterized it as an independence movement, with the United States as the prime instigator. This had the effect of uniting the Mexicans against the Texans in the name of preserving the integrity of Mexico's claim to Texas. On March 2nd, 1836, the Texans did what the Mexicans had assumed they were doing all along, and that is declare independence from Mexico. And this event occurred at a time when several thousand troops under the command of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had just arrived in Texas to crush this Texan rebellion. And he began his campaign by laying siege to the Alamo at San Antonio. And what we call the San Jacinto Campaign was the concluding military event of this Texas Revolution, and it occurred in two phases between March and May 1836. The first phase featured the appointment of Sam Houston as commander of the Texan forces and his retreat eastward from Gonzales after news arrived that Santa Anna's forces had annihilated the small garrison at the Alamo under William Barrett Travis. This initial phase also featured the advance of the Mexican armies into the settlements along the Guadalupe, Lavaca, Colorado, and Brazos rivers in pursuit of the Texas Army. Santa Anna assumed personal command of this advance, with Italian-born Vicente Filisola acting as second in command. During this phase, General Jose Urrea's division, marching parallel to Santa Anna but further south along the coast, engaged and defeated Colonel James Fannin at the Battle of Coleto Creek on March 19th. Urrea's victory was followed with the massacre of Fannin's men on March 27th. This left Houston's army as the only force left to face the Mexicans. On April 13th, while Houston was encamped near what is now Hempstead on the Brazos River, opposite Grossi's plantation, Santa Anna had reached Thompson's Ferry at what is now Richmond, further south on the Brazos. When Santa Anna learned that the Texan cabinet, including his old nemesis Lorenzo de Zavala, who was then acting as vice president of the newly established Republic of Texas, when he found out that they were at Harrisburg, totally unprotected, he took 750 men to capture the Texan government. When Houston learned that the Mexicans had crossed the Brazos, he hurriedly crossed the river himself. Santa Anna arrived at Harrisburg on the night of April 15th, found it deserted except for 3 printers at the newspaper shop. These printers told him that Houston was in full retreat to the Trinity. Don't worry. And he also told them that the cabinet had left that morning on a steamboat for Galveston. Santa Anna sent Colonel Juan Almonte and his cavalry to intercept the boat if he could. And although he failed to find the cabinet, Almonte came close to capturing David Burnett, the president, and he did seize quite a bit of supplies at New Washington, now Morgan's Point. Santa Anna decided to secure those supplies and sent Captain Miguel Bachiller to Filisola with instructions to concentrate the army at Fort Bend. Santa Anna burned Harrisburg on April 17th, arrived at New Washington on April 18th. From here, he sent another courier to Filisola requesting reinforcements of 500 men. Meanwhile, Houston's army, after crossing what is now northwest Harris County, making the turn to Harrisburg at the fork in the road at Abraham Roberts' home site, arrived on Buffalo Bayou opposite Harrisburg on the morning of April 18th. He found Harrisburg in ruins but did not know the whereabouts of the Mexicans. So he sent his scouts across Buffalo Bayou under Deaf Smith to find out what was going on. Now, when the courier Miguel Bachiller told Filisola of Santa Anna's instructions, Filisola decided to send Bachiller back to Santa Anna with another courier and a guide to let Santa Anna know that the orders had been received and would be obeyed. These 3 Mexicans were encountered by Deaf Smith scouts on April 18th and were captured. Bachiller and the courier disclosed Santa Anna's position and informed Sam Houston that Santa Anna intended to cross the San Jacinto River at Lynch's Ferry. And so on the morning of April 19th, Houston gathered his men, told them they were finally going to meet the Mexicans, and inspired them by telling them to remember the Alamo when that moment arrived. The Texans crossed Buffalo Bayou, arrived at the present Battleground State Park on the morning of April 20th. Santa Anna arrived a few hours later. There was skirmishing that day, but both sides encamped for the night a respectable distance from each other. The next day, April 21st, Houston's men, numbering about 900 in all, managed a dramatic turn of events during this first phase of the San Jacinto campaign. The Texans crossed the open field separating the armies at 4 in the afternoon and surprised the Mexicans in their encampment. The Mexicans fired the first shots while the Texans laid low. Advancing slowly in the high grass, the Texans got closer to the Mexican lines. They stopped, fired 2 volleys from their rifles, discharged the 2 small cannon known as the Twin Sisters, but they did not wait in unison to reload as the Mexicans had expected them to do. Instead, they charged the Mexican lines, screaming vengeance and brandishing Bowie knives. With the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo, remember the Goliad," Colonel Sherman's forces on the Texan left were the first to hit the Mexican lines, causing confusion and disorder within the Mexican ranks. The Texans completely overwhelmed the Mexicans in less than 20 minutes. Within a few hours, 400 Mexican soldiers were dead. Over 600 were captured, including 6 women who were with the Army at the time. And only about 40 made their escape back to the Brazos River. Many were captured later, including Santa Anna himself, who was found the following day near Vince's Bayou. The Texans had lost 2 killed, 30 wounded, 6 of them mortally. The Battle of San Jacinto and Santa Anna's capture ended the first phase of what we call the San Jacinto campaign. The second phase commenced when those few Mexican survivors reached the Brazos River near present-day Richmond. General Feliz Sola gathered them together and interviewed them, and he now found himself in command of the remainder of the Mexican army, numbering about 2,600 men in all. In a dramatic meeting held at the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Powell, among Feliz Sola, Urrea, and the top officers of the Army who were not at San Jacinto, the decision was made to withdraw. Eventually, Feliz Sola took the Mexican army beyond the Rio Grande, and Mexico was never again able to mount a sustained effort to reclaim Texas. It is the second phase, the Mexican retreat, that has largely gone unnoticed in the annals of Texas history. However, it was this phase that had the most far-reaching impact on Mexican history. Santa Anna's defeat at San Jacinto was stunning to the Mexicans, but he only lost about 1/3 of his army, and those that remained were scattered, but they nonetheless outnumbered Houston's army by almost 2-1. Feliz Sola's decision to retreat touched off a firestorm of controversy in Mexico that led to charges and countercharges by the Mexican participants for many years to come. Urrea became Feliz Sola's biggest and most outspoken critic. Feliz Sola was court-martialed and over this retreat, and although he was eventually acquitted, the turmoil took a heavy personal toll on him, as well as many of the others. And so we begin our symposium with a presentation on that nagging problem of that Mexican retreat and what was really happening behind the Mexican lines during that time. Our first speaker is Miguel Soto. Miguel Soto has been a professor at the History Department of the School of Philosophy and Letters at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, if I pronounced that correctly, since 1983. He teaches courses and seminars to undergraduates and graduate students on 19th century Mexican history. He also teaches a general course on Mexican historiography. He was a visiting scholar at the History Department and the Institute of Latin American Studies at the University of Texas in 1989, 90, 91, and 97, and he has an impressive list of publications. He is also Secretary General of the School of Philosophy and Letters at UNAM, and he was featured 2 years ago in the PBS program on the United States-Mexican War. One of our objectives in holding this symposium is to encourage Mexican scholarship on Texas history. And so we're really excited and pleased that Miguel Soto has agreed to come here from Mexico City to participate in this symposium today. His presentation will be the Mexican retreat after San Jacinto, military concerns or speculative considerations. Please join me in welcoming Miguel Soto.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very pleased to be here after overcoming many difficulties and problems to see whether I was going to be able to make it. But I'm very, very glad to be here. Well, the original notes that I have written here have changed so many times that I'm just going to talk to you about them. And we have some time concerns, so I will be checking on Jeff here to let me know how am I doing as far as time is concerned. Well, those original notes started with the following assumption. There is little doubt that Mexico lost Texas on military grounds at the Battle of San Jacinto. After talking to my colleagues, I'm not so sure anymore, and they will tell you why. But as for myself, I have thought, and that's really what I have become to teach back in Mexico, to which extent Texas was not already lost from the very beginning when the land grant policy to a great extent was developed and Mexico was never able really to take control of the situation. So what happened at San Jacinto really culminated, ended a process that had started at least 2 decades earlier, or a decade and a half earlier, say. While from the American perspective, the taking of Texas could be seen as a natural process of expansion, of territorial expansion toward the west. And for that matter, land companies developed, there was a general trend of American society through land companies. In the Mexican case, as early as 1806, during the Aaron Burr's conspiracy, there was a founding of a Mexican association in New Orleans that very much combined with the territorial expansion aims and aspirations of the conspiracy. As early as 1822, as soon as it was found out that Mexico had won its independence, even before knowing what kind of government was established, in Nashville, Tennessee, there was the founding of a Texas Association, of which Sam Houston was part of, among many other shareholders. So that started a trend in various parts of the U.S. to found land companies with Texas lands. Well, what I have found out was what was the role of the Mexican associates of many of those companies. And I will give you a couple of examples, mostly talking about Lorenzo de Zavala and Vicente Filisola, precisely. But before getting into that, I think from the Mexican perspective, what we really have to start recognizing, and I think that's the general trend nowadays in Mexico, is what were the reasons why Mexicans gave such huge land grants in Texas. Well, there were several reasons. Two of them, major security considerations for the new nation. First of all, Spain did not recognize Mexican independence in 1821 when it was proclaimed. For the next 15 years, there was a state of war between the two countries, and having Cuba and Puerto Rico next to Mexico as a possibility of reconquering Mexico by the Spanish, as it turned out to be an attempt in 1829. What the Mexican authorities were trying to do was to keep Texas from being a military platform from which an attempt could be done against Mexico, could be launched, because that was precisely what had happened during the Independence War. There were several attempts. The most important one for Mexican history is the one of Javier Mina, a Spaniard who came to fight for Mexican independence in 1816, 1817, and who put together his army in Galveston. And from there he went to Tampico and launched a very important incursion into Mexican central part of the land. So that's what the Mexican authorities were trying to avoid by giving such huge land grants, which specifically stated that the colonists would see that Mexican sovereignty was kept in these lands. The other security consideration had to do with the Indian raids that had developed mostly after the Louisiana Purchase by the U.S. An increasing trade had developed, which was taking place with merchants, American merchants based in New Orleans. And once again, the land grants stated specifically that the colonies would see that those raids were stopped and that such illegal trade was also eliminated. What did that mean? That the Mexican authorities were relying on foreign aid, the foreign colonies, to protect the unpopulated border areas. Obviously, that was a very risky matter, and some politicians, at least in Mexico, knew about the American concerns. As early as 1783, the Count of Aranda had warned what could happen with the increase in the United States to the then Spanish colonies, and some politicians in Mexico knew at the time. But it was a matter of priorities. At that time, the main threat was from Spain, and it was thought that relying on the U.S. could at least postpone some of the main dangers for these territories. But there were also two other considerations that I would like to point out, why those grants were given. Jeff Dunn just mentioned the great admiration that many politicians in Mexico had for the U.S. at the time. There were several examples of that. One of them, one of the most outstanding, is the preamble of the 1824 Constitution, precisely, written by no one else but Lorenzo de Zavala, who points out several times throughout the document the importance of the industrious, virtuous character of the Americans and how Mexicans should be like them. So it was thought, by some people at least, that bringing such industrious and laborious people to Texas, of course, would help Mexican development and Mexican society as a whole. But there was another consideration as well, and this is the one that I have developed in the last few years, is the business speculative interest that developed from the very beginning. When I started learning about the land grants, I always thought that there would be some kind of bribery, some corruption going on at the time. Well, now I'm able to say that I have found it. I'm able to document it for the later years. But I cannot think why, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't have happened like that from the very beginning. The main one, or the first one that I'm going to talk about, as I said, is the one of Lorenzo de Zavala. Lorenzo de Zavala was a politician from Yucatan. He had been involved in the founding of the constitutional ayuntamiento, the municipality rule in Mérida in 1813 and 1814. For that, he was put in jail when the absolutist restoration took place in Spain after Napoleon's defeat. And he was several years in prison. In 1820, he was released. In 1821, he became representative of Yucatan in the Spanish courts, the Spanish parliament. And then he came back to Mexico when any proposals for autonomy or main participation of the Creoles in the new government that was trying to be established was rejected completely by the Spanish authorities. So in Mexico, he became deputy of the First Congress, member of Congress from the very beginning. Then he was a senator. He became governor of Mexico, of the state of Mexico. So he was a very well-known politician. Well, what we know now of Zavala, that we knew for a long time, was that he was a close associate to the first American minister to Mexico, Joel Robert Poinsett. What we know now is that he was really a business agent of Poinsett and his associates from New York. What the documentation that I have found is Poinsett talking to his associates back in the US. Well, now Zavala has obtained the land grant according to your wishes, and he expects you to pay him and his friends for what the land has cost. Obviously, it was portrayed to be the best land in Texas, being by the coast and being next to the United States. As of course you know, the Zavala land grant was precisely next to Louisiana. So it becomes like a constant in the correspondence of Poinsett and Zavala, the petitions to be fairly remunerated for his services within the Mexican authorities. So Poinsett says very clearly, the land has cost money and it should be ready to act promptly and to send it right away. Well, the truth is that even before Zavala obtained formally his concession, his land grant, he developed a very strong sense of profit for it. He entered in several business enterprises. The land grant was huge. It was 1,000 leagues for 500 families. And for sure, being next to the United States, it was the most important, it was the door, right, to open for foreign colonization in those grounds. First of all, even before obtaining the grant, he issued a power of attorney for the American associate of Poinsett. It was a Thomas Lockett from Virginia. Later on, he replaced Lockett with Poinsett himself. Then he became involved in another enterprise with Poinsett and his replacement, that was Anthony Butler. Then he even ceded 20 leagues to a born Serb, George Fisher, who was American and then became naturalized Mexican. So he really tried several attempts in various directions, various ways, obviously trying to profit from the land grant he had obtained. Finally, as a natural continuation of all these attempts, in 1830, he went to New York, and along with other two grantees, David Burnett and Joseph Beeline, they sold their land grants for over $47,000 and founded what was called the Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company. From that, obviously, Zavala still remained as the main shareholder of the company, let me say that, besides the money that he received. But major considerations arise from that transaction. And one of them was whether Zavala was acting only on his own, or he was representative of the political group that had taken him to power. I'm talking about the Yorquino group, who put Vicente Guerrero as president and made Zavala, by the way, Secretary of the Treasury in 1829. Well, that government was overthrown. That started, the only president that was able to finish his political term was the first one, Guadalupe Victoria. Then Guerrero, through a military coup supported by Zavala precisely, took office. I even see the concession of the land grant, the authorization of Zavala's land grant, as a political reward for his political participation. And that's what I think we are trying to understand now in Mexico, how tangled the business and entrepreneurial interests were mingled with political new institutions that were being created in the country. When the Guerrero government was overthrown in 1830, as I said, Zavala came to the States and sold his land grant. But the question that arises is whether he was doing that on his own or as a representative of the Guerrero group. Guerrero was captured early in 1831, and he was accused of trying to sell Texas to the U.S. in order to get resources to come back to power, and for that purpose was using Lorenzo de Zavala as his agent. The first time I saw that, how could a leader, a hero from Mexican independence could do something like that? Would it be possible for that to happen? Yes, it was. In fact, back as early as 1813, Jose Maria Morelos, the second leader of independence, has a document in February of 1813 saying that at that time, the struggle for independence was not in such a bad shape as it had been some months earlier, when he had issued instructions to send an agent to Washington to offer Texas in exchange for some resources to continue the War of Independence. What does this mean? Well, that from then on, several political groups in Mexico considered the possibility of obtaining and gaining resources and foreign aid in exchange of some territorial integrity, particularly Texas. So it was open, a possibility was open. Let me tell you, in the particular case of Zavala and Vicente Guerrero, there was this political disruption once the Yorquino group got in power. Just about every single one of the cabinet members wrote afterwards their account of what happened, and they write really, including Zavala, of course, against each other. They write to condemn each other and what they did. The Minister of Foreign Relations at the time, Jose Maria Bocanegra, is the one that provides most of this information about the trial of Guerrero and the accusations for trying to sell Texas. Says that everything was just a complete intrigue that was developed by Poinsett and Zavala against Vicente Guerrero. Well, if that's said by the very foreign minister of relations, foreign relations of Vicente Guerrero, that's really a bad image, right? So one wonders what is worse, whether it was just a simulation or what's actually happening. What we know is that Zavala sold his land grant, and from then on developed both entrepreneurial and political concerns in Texas, and it was not a wonder that he became the first vice president of Texas. Well, that's just one example. Other findings that I have done had to do with other political groups in Mexico. Yes, someone was asking me how I evaluate Santana, and I can talk to you about it later if you want me to. But in comparison to other politicians of Mexico at the time, Well, Jeff already set me up here with the law of colonization of 1830, April 6 of 1830. That was precisely the main effort done by any Mexican authority to recover Texas from the huge amounts of foreign colonies that were coming to this territory. As you know, that law forbade any further American immigration into Texas. As a matter of fact, the law was a very complex project to recover Texas for Mexico. First of all, by stopping foreign immigration, American immigration, but also by trying to recover the main crop that Texas was producing. That combined very well with another project of the Alamán administration, as it's called. Lucas Alamán was the main leader, the political leader of that group. That was the founding of a national bank to promote the development of national industry. So it was thought that the Texan crop, the cotton, could be used to develop the national industry of the textile industry through an establishment of a close commercial relationship in the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas to the various ports of Mexico in the Gulf. So that proves how there were in Mexico some statements very sharp and very clear as to how things could be done. It went on to promote the colonization of other nations. In fact, the original bill that was presented to Congress specifically stated nations contrary to the United States, which meant, obviously, Catholics that had grievances against the Anglo-Saxon Protestants in England. It was thought mostly of Irish, so it's not a coincidence that it was Irish that deserted during the U.S.-Mexican War and became part of the Mexican army. It was an old proposal that was established right at the time of the war. It was also proposed to populate Texas with prisoners, get them to serve their jail terms in Texas. The first time I saw that, I thought, well, they were really desperate to get someone in Texas, right? But if you see what had happened in Australia, it was not that crazy, really. It was a possibility to have someone in representation of Mexico in such further distances that no other resources were able to be sent. It's very revealing as to what each one of the states at the time answered to the petition to send colonists to Texas. None of them did, because most of them said, we will become unpopulated if we do that. As you can see, many things have changed, right, since then. But at the time, that was the idea, that just Mexico didn't have enough people to take advantage of the resources and the possibility of sending people far away. The main concern really is that the political struggles that were taking place in Mexico were pretty much in the central part of the country. And this was just too far away for any real control or resources to be sent. In that regard, I would say that the military campaign of Santana is an extraordinary event in Mexican history to be able to come with so many soldiers and people. But even if they had won the Battle of San Jacinto, it would have been very, very difficult to keep. Sorry, I took longer in this, what I have meant, but going back to Lucas Alamán, he was the main promoter of that law trying to recover Mexico in 1830. 2 years later, there was another political uprising, January of 1832. It was started by Santana, no one else but Antonio Lopez de Santana, in Veracruz. The original purpose of the movement was to get rid of the cabinet ministers, accusing them of the shooting of Vicente Guerrero, and for their anti-federalist tendencies. At first, it looked like the government forces were going to be in control and be able to defeat their enemies, but as time went on, and especially during the summer, the early summer started, and the heating came to Veracruz. Veracruz was known by his terrible disease situation, and that was one of the main reasons or causes for deaths during the Mexican War with the United States. Just getting to the Mexican coast They had to get rid of it. They had to get away from it because it was terrible in the hygienic conditions. As the months went on, the government was cut from its main income, that was the Veracruz Custom Office. And in fact, Santana put the government on its knees. And Lucas Alaman, the very minister who had promoted that law to recover Texas, according to the American representative, Anthony Butler, he said that Lucas Alaman was ready to sell Texas in order to get resources and save his government. Just about everyone else who had has written about all this have said, well, Anthony Butler was a liar and he was just really saying that Alaman was ready to do something like that when he wasn't. Well, I happen to believe on Butler. I happen to believe that it was true, that someone with such clear political mind, such ideas and political concerns for Mexico, in such a desperate situation, like just about every other government in Mexico at the time was ready to sacrifice something that they saw hopeless. It was a difficult and to such a distant situation. So when I really became convinced of that, well, if Lucas Alaman, such a brilliant historian, such an academician, and such a bright politician was able to do it, just about anyone else was ready to do it. And I have become convinced of that. Just about anyone else after him, Valentin Gomez Farias, especially with a dispute between Monclova and Saltillo over the state capital, well, we're ready to use foreign aid and especially get involved the colonists, as the Monclova people did, in order to stop their political enemies, as far as even the centralization in 1835. Well, I mentioned this in order to illustrate how the combination of political needs and aspiration of various groups in Mexico opened the door several times, even to the last minute, for American interests, concerns, and even colonists to take over on these territories. Well, the other case that I'm going to mention is that one of Vicente Filisola. As Jeff said earlier, he was the second military in command of the Mexican army during the Texas campaign. Filisola wrote what is considered in Mexico the most important account of the Texas campaign. Is the book that has been reprinted or published several times, and it still is the most common source used in Mexico to study the military campaign in Texas. In fact, he completes in his work, he covers from the early periods of colonization, even the French exploration, the disputes with Louisiana, then goes on to the different land grants that were given, and then goes on to the military campaign. It's a very acute description of the campaign from the point of view of the second chief in command of the Mexican army. But Filisola doesn't mention a few important issues that are the ones that I want to raise here. First of all, he doesn't mention that he was a land grantee in Texas. His land grant was for 600 families. It was not a small one, for sure. That as late as May of 1835, most probably, sometimes I have said without doubt, but since there are some doubts of documents, he received at least $2,000 from New York associates to form what was to be called the Filisola Association. What is interesting about this is that Filisola condemns all these land speculators and these colonists, ungrateful colonists that develop against Mexico and all this, all that, but he doesn't say a word of his own case. Well, that's rather common on those political years in Mexico, maybe not only those years. Why did he write in the first place? Well, to distract the attention from his own responsibility and his own political interests and economic interests. Trying to bring all this to the meaning of the Mexican retreat here in San Jacinto, as Jeff said, 2/3 of the Mexican army were the ones that were retreated by the personal responsibility of Filisola. Well, the first thing that Filisola did was to ask for a court-martial to clear his image, to vindicate his image. And indeed, he proved that it was not his own decision, but the decision of the main leaders, the military leaders that were around him. But even with that, I cannot stop but wonder what were the main reasons for Filisola to retreat. Were they really national considerations for the best hope for the country, or were those business speculative considerations sending a signal to the other side of the border saying, well, one thing is war and one thing is business, and you take care of my lands and I will be coming back as soon as I can? I really think that's what he was doing, because that's what all the others were doing. In fact, I didn't mention, but Filisola offered himself on his own will to come to the Texas campaign. Well, he came to try to take care of his lands. Obviously didn't quite work out, but that's what he was trying to do. And as late as 1837, he was trying to still do business in Mexico City with his Texas lands. And one of them, James Street, is the one that had offered the money in the first place, the one that had been used as the agent of the New York associates to pay Filisola. Well, you might say, can you really prove all that? The very fact that he doesn't mention a word in his book, that's a bad signal, right? The very fact that he accuses all the others, that also makes you aware of something is going on in here. But unless I find a definite document saying that he didn't receive it, I will state that what happened in Mexico, and that's really bringing here what many people have asked me, how Mexicans see now things as far as Texas and the US, and the war with the U.S. Mexico confronted a very hard time, very difficult time. It was not only Mexico, it was all over Hispanic America. After overthrowing the Spanish rule, to create a new order, George was mentioning Bolivar and San Martin, they all shared tremendous difficulties. What Santana did in his very last government, become the dictator for life, and to be able to appoint his own replacement, that's a proposal that Bolivar established back as early as 1826. Santana did not invent any political solution for Spanish America. Those were the problems that were confronted. How to create a new state, a new government that is really able to put together all the efforts and interest in such a dissembled society. I think now we are talking about the Balkanization of Spanish America after the Spanish rule was overthrown. I think that's what it is. And in that situation, aspirations and interests, the control about the control of the resources, whether we are talking about church ties, custom offices, or lands like in Texas, those were the main reasons the people were talking about, and they were fighting over. It was not abstract political principles, not even the Freemasonry lodges that were established and were very political, highly politically involved. It was interests. Those were the concerns of those people. So what I'm convinced that what I've been able to find in the Texas case, it could be illustrated just about any other sphere of society. Many of my students ask me, was that only privative of Mexico? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think behind the Andrew Jackson government, in fact, the main associate of Filisola, Samuel Swartout, was the administrator of the New York Custom Office. And I think the government of the people of Andrew Jackson, what it is a replacement of an old aristocracy from Philadelphia, from New York business men that were taking over. I really believe that this kind of approaches would help us understand on both sides of the border on a more realistic terms what was going on at that time. And I really hope that will help us as well to understand what is happening and what could be happening for the benefit of the two our countries. Thank you very much.
We're going to ask Miguel to take a few questions from the audience, but I first want to say that was extremely profound what you were saying. And I'm also glad you got some substance in there about Joel Poinsett, the American minister, since we mostly remember him as the originator of the poinsettia plant, since he sent the plant to his American friends in the 1820s. But if anybody has any questions for Miguel, I'd like to do that because he has a plane to leave later today, and he won't be able to have a discussion with the other speakers later. Yes, sir.
From a Mexican point of view, what was the key factor which
Well, I would say I could answer on two different levels. At the time, even when Congress learned about what had happened and how Santana and then Filisola entered in negotiations with the Texans, immediately there was a response from Congress rejecting any treaty whatsoever that would be signed with the Texans, hoping that Texas would be recovered. That lasted really up to the time of Texas annexation to the United States. Only as late as 1845, the administration of Jose Joaquin de Herrera was finally able to convince the Mexican Congress, to recognize Texas independence. At that time, with the condition of not becoming part of any other country. That was between March and May of 1845. Obviously, that was too late, as Fletcher has said, too late and too little, and Texas became part of the United States. What I try to explain on the second level of my answer is that now we are really beginning to understand and to admit the Mexican responsibility on all these issues. I was saying earlier that sometimes my students say, well, why to spend so much time tracking and following all these details of Mexican politicians and their dealings at the time? Well, because in a way, with a good reason, after the war with the U.S., Mexico has become, the U.S. has become the scapegoat of Mexico's troubles. Everything was because of the Americans did and the Americans' abuses and all this and that, which is not completely untrue. But there's a lack of assumption of responsibility on our side, which I think should be stopped. I think, yes, we are a victim to a certain extent, but we are the main provokers of many of those things in the first place. So as long as we are able to accept and admit that, I think we'll be on a safe side. And by this, obviously, many times I have been accused of pro-Yankee, pro-American, and all this. I have never denied American territorial expansion. It was there. Probably the Americans did not any invitation to come to Texas, but the very fact is that there was a Mexican invitation, an open door, and please come and help us. Well, going to foreign aid to rely on security concerns, as the Mexican authorities did at the time of independence, it was a very risky matter, and it proved to be like that very soon. I don't know if I answered your question. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, since Austin's first petition was done not to Mexico but to the Spanish authorities, what were the considerations, the reasons for the Spanish to authorize that, whether it was against France or any other country? The first application of American settlers, what I have found, goes back to 1813. Maybe there might be even some earlier ones, but that's the one that I have found of important consideration. The Spanish courts at the time, the king was in France, prisoner of Napoleon at the time. The Spanish parliament authorized the concession to Thomas Green, as I recall. No, it's not Thomas. It's Green from the U.S. And with the condition that 2/3 of the colonies that he will settle in Texas would be from Spanish origin, and only 1/3 could be American. That specific proposal of 1813 was against France. In 1820, as far as I know, and that's what Greg Cantrell shows once again in his later biography of Austin, it was really a decision of the local governor of Texas through the intervention of the Baron de Bastrop, this associate of Austin. It was not a major consideration in Madrid or somewhere else. What is interesting of Austin is that it was the only one that was ratified by the Spanish authorities, the Emperor of Iturbide, Agustin de Iturbide, and then the federal government in 1824. All the other land grants were given by the state authorities according to the federal law of colonization of 1824, given to each one of the states the policies to establish the terms under which conditions the colonies would come. Everyone else, there was a huge line already in 1825 when the state law of colonization was issued, March of 1825, and within weeks, the first huge land grants were offered, and even if one takes into account for how many colonists were those grants given, and how many members of the families, talking about farmer families, within a matter of years, the Mexican population would have been overcome, as it actually happened. Something that was not foreseen by the Mexican authorities was the demographic capacity of the United States, doubling its size every 20 years through the first decades of the 19th century. So they never even dreamed what was going to happen in Texas, but it happened. And then there becomes the reaction, too late, obviously, and trying to control a situation that got out of hand. That was the main point, right, of my presentation. I think San Jacinto only ended a process that had been started years earlier. Yes, yes. I think this will be the last question. Yes, sir. Well, more than, the question is, what do I think if Jose Urrea, being a native Mexican, had been appointed as second of Santana, the outcome of the campaign had been different. I would say that it was not a matter of being native or no, of military ability, right, and capacity that Urrea had proved very clearly. It would have been a different matter. But once again, I really believe there that when Filisola was there as a second on command, we were talking about earlier today, Urrea didn't have any chance. He just had to, even if he was not convinced himself of the retreat, even de la Peña's account of Urrea's attitude says, well, unfortunately my general was not able to defend and to stand himself on his ground, opposing the retreat. So if he was the capable military man at the time, he was not in control of the situation, and that's what happened. Well, I thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel. We're now going to have a 15-minute break. There are refreshments outside. We'll be back here at 2:15 exactly for Jim Chris. Thank you.